Hello, everybody. This is John Faris from United Arab Emirates. Welcome, everybody, to the fourth symposium of the Global Economic Electronic Forum. This symposium is entitled The Future of Global Economy, Growth Challenges and Risks of Depression. I would like to welcome the speakers, the panelists, and I would like to thank the host, Trends, for hosting this panel on the future of the global economy. This is the fourth symposium of a series of symposiums under the Global Economic Electronic Forum that Trends hosted. The first symposium was back in June when the discussion was focused on the effects of the global economy and the impact of COVID on the economy and its repercussions. Following that symposium, the second symposium was held in the beginning of mid-July, where discussion was on the government response and the economic stimulus programs around the world. And by late July, a third symposium was hosted as well, focusing on the reopening of national and global economies. What are the early lessons learned based on the reopening? Today, we're going to look a little bit forward into the future, and we're going to think about the implication of post-COVID and what will happen in a post-COVID area. As I said, the title will be about the future of the global economy, both challenges and risks and potentially opportunities. The main questions that we will be addressing is we will focus around the what will be the return to economic activities? What will it look like? What are the legacies or the imbalances between countries and trading blocs in the post-COVID era? What are the new norms? What are we calling the new norms? What are the new models that are emerging from the crisis? And we'd like to discuss also the future of multilateralism and international economic institutions, particularly since our panelists today are from three very pertinent international organizations that are focusing on the economic sectors and trade sectors, development and trade. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you our three panelists for tonight. We have Bob Koopman, the Chief Economist and Director of Economic Research at the World Trade Organizations based in Switzerland. We also have Dr. Rabah Areski. He's the Chief Economist for the MENA region at the World Bank based in Washington, D.C. And we also have Dr. Jeronim Capaldo, Economic Affairs Officer from UNCTAD, again, also from Switzerland. So we have a great panel with us today, and I personally look forward to a very interesting and good discussion among ourselves. The way the program will go today, we will have the opportunity to hear from the speakers up front, some opening remarks, around 15 to 20 minutes presentations from each speaker. Following the presentations, we will have an open discussion, questions and answers, questions that we have prepared based on the feedback that we've been getting from the audience following the announcement of the session, but also we would welcome any additional questions as we go during the presentations themselves. So we will have that for around 30 to 40 minutes before we close the webinar. So without any further delays, let me pass on the mic to Dr. Bob Koopman for his presentation on trade, the WTO, and the future of global integration. Bob, please go ahead.
Thanks, Dr. Faris, and thanks to Trends for inviting me to share some thoughts on these highly relevant topics. I'm going to share my presentation with you now. Okay, I think you can see it. Okay.
If you can, please go ahead. If you don't mind, put a slideshow. Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about trade, the WTO, and the future of global integration, give you some thoughts on that. The first point I want to make is that long-term forces actually drive trade growth. And those long-term forces are usually macroeconomic forces. There is a role for trade policies, trade liberalization, but essentially things like economic growth, GDP growth, growth in investment, growth in consumption, even government expenditures, fiscal policy, monetary policy, these are all very important drivers of global trade growth, and it turns out also big contributors to global imbalances. Investment turns out to be very trade intensive. So if you want to understand what's happening in global trade in, say, the last 20 years, it's been very important to know what's been happening to global investment. UNCTAD does a lot of work on this, and it's very helpful to us in trying to develop future forecasts for trade growth, as well as analyze past relationships. So as I said, investment's both trade intensive. So when you look at the GDP components, you find out that investment is the most trade intensive of the GDP components, followed by consumption, and then followed by government expenditures. X minus M is endogenous, but exports obviously are very trade intensive. They have a lot of imports in them. As I mentioned, liberalization policies, broadly whether multilateral, bilateral, unilateral, account for about 25% of trade growth. It's important to keep this in mind because then when you think about recent trade conflict and trade tariffs increasing, say between the US and China, potentially between the US and EU, US, Canada, you could list a number of countries. They're not likely to have as big an impact on trade as perhaps those policymakers would like. They can have a very significant impact on the bilateral relationship in particular sectors. You see a lot of trade diversion, a lot of trade shifting that occurs as a result, but they don't necessarily change the overall level of global imbalances, particularly aggregate imbalances for any particular country. So why would you bother with trade liberalization, you might ask? Well, I would argue that it's very important for long-term growth. It essentially, trade liberalization, increased trade, whether it's from liberalization or just GDP growth, particularly through that investment mechanism, helps shift out the production possibility frontier, and you get the dynamic effects of trade liberalization. What we're likely to see from things like trade conflict and the pandemic impacts on trade and investment is a reduction in potential future GDP growth across a broad range of countries. That's a very significant concern to me. Whether it's a result of the pandemic, the health-related policies were absolutely necessary. Some of the macro, financial, fiscal, monetary policies that are being put in place could actually, in the end, they're needed now, but if they're not carefully managed, could lower long-term growth. And then you also have what we see from trade conflict. So the biggest declines of GDP and trade in decades are coming about because of the pandemic. We're very concerned about a weak recovery, particularly if the psychological effects on consumers and businesses, from confidence to habits, result in a very weak recovery in investment and consumption. We see significant declines in consumption and investment right now. There's some happy announcements that, gee, we've seen some recovery in employment and consumption as some of the health-related policies have been unwound, but it's not clear that those recoveries are going to get anywhere near back to the original level of consumption growth and investment growth. Another potential source for weak recovery is if government policies are either not large enough or if they're structurally ineffective at dealing with the demand and liquidity issues. Governments have been very aggressive in these policies. That's a big change from the global financial crisis. Personally, I think it's a good change, but we still don't know how effective they're going to be. So that's something we have to watch for. We also don't know if they're big enough or large enough. The big impact on trade has come from decreased consumption and investment, but also from increases in trade costs. There's been a supply shock from reduced labor participation. Keep in mind, most capital is fine, most physical infrastructure is fine. It's really been about labor participation And if those health issues are resolved, we could see a pretty quick recovery in the utilization of that capital and infrastructure. But again, that's going to depend on the confidence and habits of consumers and firms. So what does this mean for globalization? I would argue that it really is about a reorganization of globalization, what I call reglobalization. I don't expect, nor did I expect prior to the pandemic and the trade conflict, to see rapid recovery of trade growth to what we saw in that 1990 to 2005 period, where trade growth was about greater than 2 times faster than income growth and trade elasticity. I think those were very unique circumstances. China, India, former centrally planned economies of Europe, all opening up. That created very, very unusual environment. Large elements of global population and labor force, often well-trained, entering into the global economy after being isolated for many years. That generated this extraordinary increase in trade growth. What I would expect is to see long-term trade growth move back towards something like the 1865 to present ratio, which is about 1.4 times. Trade growth is about 1.4 times income growth. I expect to see more digital cross-border trade. I expect more diversification in supply chain sourcing, more automation and production of supply chain steps, and more flexible production processes. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that the fundamental forces laid out by Adam Smith and David Ricardo for specialization and comparative advantage, those are still going to be at play. They're not going away. But firms are going to change their weights and values on things like risk versus efficiency. So the risk of production disruptions versus lowest absolute cost of production. That will affect those calculations to some extent, but the fundamental forces are still going to be there. And I think governments will be making similar calculations. So as I say here, the mitigation of risks of future pandemics, crises, or trade policy uncertainty, firms, household governments are going to need to evaluate this risk versus efficiency trade-off. For some of the elements firms are going to consider are inventories. Will they move from so much just in time to larger inventories for critical parts? They're going to diversify their supply chains. McKinsey has a great report that's out just recently that talks about what they've seen in terms of firms' potential responses to this kind of over concentration of sourcing, production, automation, and digitization. This is really a risk versus efficiency calculation for them. And they have a number of levers to play with in there. I don't think trade goes away. I think trade is an important part of the solution. Governments, they're going to have to figure out how to manage demand spikes above average supply. Firms produce for average supply. They don't want to have excess inventories lying around. They aim for average supplies with some regional, with some seasonal adjustments in there. So I think governments are going to have to think about how they build and manage emergency stockpiles in a way that taxpayers and citizens can afford and accept. Keep in mind that governments and households are likely to be liquidity constrained in the aftermath of the pandemic. While there may be a lot of interest in what I think might be false security for reshoring a lot of production, there's going to be a lot of demand for dealing with these kinds of crises as efficiently as possible. Flexible domestic production and perhaps international insurance agreements. There'll be tracking and tracing that governments are likely to introduce. And we're going to have uncertainty as to the requirements of the next pandemic crisis. Is it climate? Is it a non-respiratory health crisis? If it's non-respiratory and you've built a lot of capacity to build respirators, that may not help you in the next pandemic. Again, there's this risk versus efficiency trade-off. Households are going to have to deal with things like remote work, increasing remote work. Not every country can do this, so there'll have to be capacity building. But I suspect there'll be a lot more sensitivity among many households, particularly those with higher education and access to the internet to do this kind of thing. There'll be concerns around privacy. I'll get to this a little bit. If we have fragmentation of the global digital economy into 3 regions, US, EU, China, centric regions, this could have very big implications when it comes to privacy and the ability to social distance and earn income from remotely get access to critical services such as education, healthcare, etc. I'm a professor at the Graduate Institute. Last semester, all my classes flipped to digital. Most of the students stayed. Many students for the forthcoming semester may not come to Switzerland. They may stay home and access if they have connectivity. And then the ability to access and purchase necessary products while isolated. This is some data from that McKinsey study I was just telling you about. I have a link in my slides. Feel free to share my slides, please. I don't want to spend much time talking about it, but they basically feel that these kinds of shocks could result in companies losing up to about 40% of annual profits over a 10-year period. If it's a long-term shock, it could be a 100-day disruption. It could wipe out an entire year's earning in that 10-year period. That's the kind of economics they're going to be thinking about in terms of what's their risk versus efficiency trade-off. And then McKinsey estimates that you could see companies shifting their production and sourcing, and that could result in anywhere from 16 to 20%, 26% of global trade. That sounds pretty reasonable to me. How much of that is reshoring? I don't think a lot of it will be, going back to those fundamental forces and these other mechanisms that firms can use. In fact, McKinsey starts talking about some of these other mechanisms. I was very happy for the McKinsey study. My team hasn't had time to look at this, but McKinsey, I think, validates many of the things that I've been arguing about in my presentations. Just quickly, what do we see for global trade growth? In April, we put out some scenarios, optimistic, pessimistic scenario. The green line to the far right of this chart is the optimistic scenario, a decline in trade of about 13%, about what we saw in the great financial crisis of 2008. The red line is the pessimistic scenario, 32% decline. That's about what we saw in global trade growth, aggregate decline in the great financial and the Great Depression in the 1930s over a period of years. What we see so far, that's given by the dotted lines, is something that's much closer to the optimistic scenario, but with weak recovery. So the weak recovery looks more like the pessimistic scenario in the out years. And that's the reason we're closer to the optimistic scenario is that most of the shocks have been in, some of the biggest shocks, most of the shocks have been in services, and many of those services are non-tradable. Restaurants, local retail, entertainment, those kinds of things. There have been very big shocks to those. But tradable services such as tourism and things like that have also been very heavily hit. But those tend to be less trade intensive than manufacturing. I'm not going to talk about this other than to say, if you look at what IMF, World Bank, OECD, WTO have said for both GDP and trade, we're all in the same area, but there's a lot of uncertainty compared to historical experience. So some of us are giving ranges. We did the optimistic and pessimistic scenario. OECD's done single hit, double hit scenario. The IMF has been talking recently about downgrading their trade growth. So I think you'll see that our GDP and trade growth, we've got a great deal of uncertainty, but our ranges are in the same area. And this is for trade. I'll leave that on. Let me move on. What are we worried about going forward? The big policy response is absolutely necessary. But what happens in the aftermath of the pandemic? How are they withdrawn? How do we adjust to this significant inflow of both fiscal policies and liquidity, monetary policy easing? There could be significant political resistance to removing some of these policies that were intended to deal with the shocks from the pandemic. You get this political economy effect, rent-seeking, to keep those in place. I used to work in agriculture. Trust me, those policies are very hard to remove. If they stay in place too long, you create a pretty strong rent-seeking community to pursue those. At this point, I'm much less worried about the direct support in terms of income support to households as to some of the financial support to firms. I think that could be the stuff that's more difficult to withdraw. That could have long-term implications for productivity growth and efficiency, particularly if there's a large number of zombie or zombie-like firms that are sustained by this kind of support. The longer-term implications. So on the left-hand side of this chart, I have the US economy as projected by CBO in about 2007. So you see that top blue line, that was CBO's views of potential US GDP projected out to about 2013, 2014. Red lines what happened to real GDP. You can see real GDP never recovered back to CBO potential GDP. Now, what CBO then ended up having to do, because there was much less capital accumulation, much slower productivity growth, is they revised their potential GDP downward. And that if you bring current CBO potential GDP, you see it's much closer to the aftermath of the financial crisis where real GDP was. On the right-hand side of this chart, we have some scenarios that we generated in 2012 at the WTO, optimistic and pessimistic scenarios for long-term GDP and trade growth. The blue lines, both solid and dotted, represent the optimistic scenario. The red lines, the pessimistic scenarios. The green lines represent what's happened since. And you can see that in the green lines, we're much closer to the pessimistic scenario than the optimistic scenario. And of course, when we put 2020 in there, we're going to be below the pessimistic scenario. But what happens when we revise these numbers for the optimistic scenario, we have to revise potential output downward because of foregone capital accumulation and growth that didn't occur, that we in the optimistic scenario we expected to occur. It didn't occur. So potential growth is reduced. This has very significant implications, particularly for small, medium, and developed countries and small, medium, and large developing countries. So I'm very concerned about potential growth going forward. I should wind up here pretty soon. I'm going to just talk about some of the issues around trade war versus pandemic, tariffs versus uncertainty. The direct effects of tariffs that we see in the trade wars that we've seen recently, these in economic terms are lost deadweight loss triangles. They're pretty small. They don't amount to a whole lot. And there's much more significant moving around of what we call the rent-seeking rectangles, producer and consumer surplus. Particularly in a country like the US, a fair amount of movement of producer surplus from consumers to producers, and within producers from other firms that they're supplying. However, these indirect effects can be large. You can have long-term reduction in global growth potential from lost investment or inefficient investment, lost consumption. So you have a slower shifting out of the production possibility frontier. Now, this isn't saying anything about global inequality, and there are significant concerns about that. I have some slides that talk about that. Let me go back to this one. Why do we see some of the conflict? Well, unbalanced growth globally, regionally, nationally, subnationally, and by sector, labor skill category, demography, households. How much of this has got to do with trade? I would argue trade contributes. It definitely has positive and negative effects. And there are definitely some negative effects in some sectors, some regions. We've seen this in recent research. And it is one of the forces that need to be dealt with. However, I am a subscriber to the belief, and based on quantitative assessments that I've seen, that trade contributes maybe 20% of these forces, and that it's technology, changing consumer preferences, demography, some of the economic geography forces unrelated to trade that result in this unbalanced growth. And that if you try to fix these global imbalances, level the playing field with trade policy, you're going to miss some of the fundamental drivers. So I'm going to close here. I've got many other slides. If you have questions about it, feel free to send them to me. But essentially what I'm going to suggest is that we need significant cooperation and coordination between finance ministries and trade ministers, between health ministers, education ministers, labor ministers, to make sure that countries come up with a set of coordinated, integrated policies to deal with these forces. Trade can have a role. It can play a positive role, have these both positive and negative impacts, usually very sectoral or even geographically concentrated. But if you don't have these other policies in place, you're not going to solve the problem. So I'm very worried when it comes to things like multilateral cooperation and the challenges around the WTO, that the WTO and its trade ministers are actually being asked to carry too big a burden. They're being asked to solve global imbalances that really require other more important ministries, well, those who oversee fiscal policy and monetary policy, and they also need to coordinate to ensure that the effects of adjustment, whether it's from trade, technology, changing consumer preferences, that there's an effective safety net and adjustment policies in place to help mitigate those effects. I'll stop there. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Bob. That was a great presentation. We will have the opportunity to talk in the open questions and answers part of this webinar on the role of multilateral agencies and international organizations. And we're basically, maybe we can get more into what you were closing on the role of WTO and others in terms of coordination. But I also want to have a quick follow-up on what you were talking about, the trade-offs between risks and efficiencies. And I wonder whether, I mean, obviously these trade-offs will have important implication on trade flows, as you described, important implication potentially on trade routes. And I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on who are the winners and losers from these changes, and what are the role of governments basically in this transition?
That's a good question. So here's what we've seen so far, and what we've seen so far based on the trade conflict between the US and China. What we see there is a pretty significant amount of trade diversion to other countries. And let me pick one of countries, Mexico. So Mexico, when it signed NAFTA, saw one of its major economic development policies using trade as a supplier of parts and components to the United States, or an assembler of final goods to the United States, particularly, as we noted, automobiles. In one of my earlier slides, I would have talked about that. But a big element was supposed to be electronics. And instead, China's rise directly competed with Mexico's strategy to supply electronic parts, components, or assembly of electronics from the United States, parts and components, or supply parts and components to higher end US manufacturing. So China's rise, many people in the US complain about China's rise, but it had very significant effects on Mexico and Mexico's economic development strategy. It also had very significant effects on other Asian countries' economic development strategies. Now, it benefited because of economic geography and gravity, in that it could also, China could source parts and components from some of those other Asian countries and assemble them and then ship the final goods to the United States. But China's also been rising up the value chain and reducing its imports of those parts and components. It's now actually outsourcing some of the lower end activities to Asia. This is a very complex evolution, but what we've seen from the trade conflict is trade diversion, where the trade conflict between the US and China is not necessarily reducing overall US imports. Prior to the pandemic, we didn't see a significant decline in US imports. What we did see was a shift in sourcing of those imports. So this is one of those things that's convinced me, not only are some of our fundamental trade models that show us trade diversion, trade creation kinds of things relatively validated by the trade conflict, but that that the ability to use trade policy to change fundamental unbalances that are much more savings investment, macro policy, perhaps reserve currency driven, are going to be just, it's not going to be particularly effective.
Okay, thank you, Bob. This is great. Let's move on to the next presentation. Dr. Rabah Areski from the World Bank, the Chief Economist for the MENA region. Dr. Rabah will talk about the way forward. Dr. Rabah.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you for the kind invitation. I'll be sharing my presentation. Just a second. Yeah, here we go. So, following on the presentation and the theme of Bob, I'm going to try and have a more domestic perspective while trying also to weighing into the global debate. So the main takeaway from this presentation, which I hope would be brief, is really the very basic message is the need to focus on the health response, and I think we learned that lesson very it's been quite a stark reminder, the second wave and the rise in cases in many parts of the world. And but still, there is a need to preserve and protect consumption and production capabilities. And the other message at the domestic level is really the need to postpone instinct of fiscal consolidation that we've seen rising in many countries, while also, and this is particularly relevant for developing country, to try and proactively reduce leakages, and by leakages I mean outright corruption and things of that nature, but also the kind of things that have to do with monopolization of import sectors and things that not only would create fiscal space but also prepare or pave the way for recovery. So the second, I just typed that slide to try and make sense of the more global perspective on things. So what I really see as extremely important to understand where we are and where we're headed is that while there is this theme of rebuilding as new that has become quite fashionable, and we're all talking about a greener global economy, a more digitalized one, and more solidarity, the path to this hopeful and brighter world is actually quite narrow. And let me try, I know Bob talked a lot about trade policy. I'm going to try and look at it from the more market structure element, which I hope complements what he said. And I think that there is a need to focus on now that how to get there to that hopeful world, and the way to think about it, at least the way I look at it, is that there are two opposite countervailing forces that are widening the gap between these firms that are rising in market power, concentrating, and I think Bob gave a great example with the fact that just in time would reinforce multinational corporation because they're seen as more reliable, more resilient. But overall, what this crisis is doing is it could have been a great Schumpeterian moment where you'll have new entry, more exit, and again that rebuilding as new would have been the silver lining of that crisis. But yet, what we see is that this is the survival of the deep pocket of the big firm, the curse of bigness, as some authors have called it, not the fittest. And we see that in the multinational trade world, but we also see it at the domestic level with the zombification of firms that have access to cheap credit and things of that nature. So on the one side, you have that force where you have rising market power, which gives, of course, more more strength to the negotiation on wages and other things to the big firm. And on the other side, you have rising unemployment, rising inequality in the developing world. It's the informal sector also paying a heavy price, and also because of lockdown measures. And so you have that, more demand for unemployment insurance, for social protection, for minimum wage, and you're gonna, we see more protest, outright protest as well. So you've got these two opposite forces, and it is unclear how these two opposite forces are going to reconcile. They're going to come together because they are pulling in different directions. And the way I look at it, and I'm hoping this could be a great area for discussion. This is very tentative. Is I see the key policy instrument to try and resolve that as competition policy, and the reason is because typically this type of redistribution or weighing, attending to this social demand as unsustainable unless you really have that value creation and a sustainable way to finance this program. So competition policy can try and resolve that. Yet the way competition policy typically is mandated to act is when there is obvious abusive behavior. Yeah, in this case, it's it's really an exogenous shock whereby even if the firm is not predatory in its behavior, it's just, his competitor went bankrupt and suddenly you went from having 50% market share to 100. And it's not quite clear how we deal with that because we are constrained by the fact that we want the economy to keep going. We want firm to stay afloat. But because of the element of market structure I mentioned, this may be causing quite a bit of problem going forward. So I'll leave it at that, and I hope we will have time for discussion. But it's really, I think an element of tension that we've got to think hard on how to resolve. So I'm going to go very quickly. These are things that are pretty well known, but I'm going to split my presentation in three parts: the pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. So this is really a crisis of preparedness in many countries, and I'm also here referring to the Middle East and Africa in particular, but this is true for most countries, including the developed countries. Many countries arrived to the crisis with low social and fiscal buffer. There were widespread protests in the region, but also elsewhere. Distrust, element of government illegitimacy. We've seen that in Lebanon quite acutely. There's also in many developing countries, but also again in advanced world, element of the polarized labor market, and the confinement measure have led to that rise in inequality, and the lack of fair competition has also limited our way to innovate out of that crisis. So during COVID, again, a unique crisis in that it has both supply and demand feedback loops, unlike the Great Recession and the global depression. The oil price collapse, which originally combined an unfortunate price war that was launched at the onset of the COVID crisis, plus the demand side effect. So these two, COVID shock and this dual shock of COVID and oil prices, are really distinct, but quite intertwined as well. So the immediate response was one of a blanket response, and the hope is that as we go, targeting really becomes the rule. But the blanket instrument was justified in the face of that huge uncertainty, and also as a way to calm market and reassure the citizenry. But of course, given the protracted nature of the crisis, the targeting is quite instrumental, both on the health side but also on the economic side. And again, the two, the health response and the economic response, which essentially is about financing the health response, but also offering relief to consumers and firms to avoid the scars of that from that crisis. The two, again, health and economic, are intertwined and self-reinforcing. Bob talked about the cost of the crisis and the fact that forecasters has essentially been over optimistic at the beginning. Some have offered ranges, but clearly the type of V-shaped recovery hasn't panned out as we all thought it would. Loss of 3% of GDP projected by the IMF to now 8% in 2021. The developing world, even so, there are lots of uncertainty and a lot of lack of clarity on statistics. Has also been affected indirectly through many channels, including the financial instability and capital outflow, the trade and the disruption of supply chain, the commodity channel, and tourism and remittances have been quite important on top of the direct health channel. So this is really about making decision under uncertainty, and there is really an element of non-ergodicity, and the vaccine discussion is really an interesting one from that perspective. And it is actually, in my perspective, it's quite a challenge to put all our hope on the vaccine. Why we haven't yet shaped the health, the public health response in a way that I think should be appropriate. So I'll come back to that. But really, the precautionary principle called for this lockdown, which are clearly unsustainable, especially in developing countries, given the duality of the society and the labor market. But these are really 14th century solution for a world that we thought was a modern information world, and clearly the link, the strategic capability of government and its ability to coordinate with the private sector and scientific community has been tested, including in advanced economy. Some Asian countries who had previous experience with SARS and others seem to have fared better, but even in Singapore, the weak link of expatriate has also come back to roost and triggered a new wave of cases, and we know that the Gulf countries have also this weak link problem, where with the expat also living in difficult condition and being a source of hotspot. So really a crisis of huge uncertainty, but also really thinking in terms of weak link at the country level, but also at the global level. And I'll come to the need for that global coordination, not just on vaccine, but more generally on how to help the weakest link, the poorest country, in order to eradicate the disease, both local level but global level as well. So really the importance of masking, testing, and contact tracing as a targeted way of doing lockdown is the only way forward, and we've got to mobilize these more information based and the strengths of statistical capability. We should mobilize that to try and be more targeted in the approach because of the unsustainability of complete lockdown. So there is a global challenge for medicines. There are different ways of going at it. In very poor countries, it's very clear that integrating the type of intervention into basic health structure and is quite important given the limited ability of this country to finance the health response. But there are many directions: antivirals, indirect therapy, immune therapy, the vaccine as well. But again, here it's a bit outdated. There's many more vaccine trials underway, but it is unclear, as we know from the flu, that the vaccine would achieve that herd immunity that we desire, because of uncertainty regarding the mutation of the virus and things of that nature. So it is important to get the health response right now, and not wait for a miracle from the vaccine. I'm hoping we'll have a discussion on this, and of course there are many calls for allowing access to medicine, on patenting issue, to allow for again a global access to not only to vaccine but equipment to eradicate at the global level. The example of smallpox and the way it was eradicated through intervening in the poorest country was quite important to avoid the second waves. So clearly there are issues with private sector incentive when you start intervening and controlling prices. There is very strong capability in the private sector, but they do need indeed the type of incentive. Michael Kramer has been advocating for advanced purchase as a way to incentivize both R&D but also production at scale, so we can reach the poorest country. So many advanced economies have done whatever it takes, and indeed they arrive at that crisis with the ability to borrow and use their own currency. As a result, they could deploy both fiscal and monetary policy by injecting liquidity in the financial system. This is absolutely appropriate given the nature of the crisis. But of course, for developing country, it's a very different game. Rising taxes and cutting spending is certainly not appropriate in the midst of a crisis. It can get things worse. But so far, some countries have managed to borrow from international market, and reminds me of what happened in the corporate bond market in the US, whereby many corporations had borrowed and stashed cash, borrowed from the corporate bond market, given the relatively low rate. So far, the bond market has been quite amazing, and countries have taken advantage of that. But we are not out of a situation where suddenly risk premium can hike and put countries in a difficult situation, especially if you borrow in foreign currency. There are important constraints, and the international organization should do more to try and help countries to finance their health response and get a handle on the crisis, but also protect and preserve the consumption and production capability. The risk of depression is very much there. The zombification also is a problem, also because it will not allow the economy to restart in ways that we wish it would. It is unclear what the effect on inflation would be, because both consumption is going down, precautionary saving because of increase in precautionary saving and decline in income, but also because production is going down. And as I mentioned, there is an employment pool that's rising with demands on minimum wage and others. And this tension I raised earlier with the rise in market power. So to prepare for the recovery, really, again, getting a handle on health is the best investment, fundamental point, but there are elements of centrality that I think needs to be thought through when it comes to intervention in the economy. For instance, it is quite fundamental to support and even bail out as needed all the network industries that are really core to the economy, and then other sectors that are the second circle around these network industries. Tourism, restaurants, hospitality could benefit from easy credit, but of course there is a third circle, which are the downstream communication, gaming, and all that, who certainly don't need a bailout, as they are doing quite well. So the theme of rebuilding, as I mentioned, is very much out there, and we are all seeing that as the silver lining from that crisis. But the path to that world is very narrow, and there are tons of issues along the way, including how we deal with bankruptcy, how we can restructure corporate debt, and many countries are ill-equipped to do that. The US has, after the 2008 crisis, had set up agencies to do this type of corporate restructuring, and is well equipped to do that. Some countries have put in place bankruptcy laws, especially in the region, but very few have activated them. And the risk of zombification, or further zombification, is there, and anemic growth is quite there. So the business environment issues, the strengthening of the competition apparatus is quite there. Is quite at the forefront of how and why we should try and leave that Schumpeterian moment and set off that innovation tide should be on the mind of all the policymakers. So I'm going to skip that, since Bob talked extensively about the issues of reconfiguration of global supply chain, but I'll just mention that there is indeed from that, I understand that because of just in time, but not exclusively, there'll be reconfiguration that would benefit multinational corporations, which may redirect their investment, but essentially would be seen as the more reliable players, and as a result will have more market power, as also at the domestic level. So trading service, I'm also going to skip that, but lots of hope that this will be driving global growth. There's a very long road to recovery. Many countries will need debt restructuring. We've seen some Latin American country being relatively successful. I'm worried about Africa and some part of the Middle East, where waiting is not the right solution. So debt restructuring, debt cancellation should be put on the table for the poorest country. There were initiatives that the bank and the IMF had through the G20 had championed on moratorium, but that's clearly now insufficient, and the private sector, the private creditor, need to be involved in this initiative to buy time and space for countries to deal with that health crisis, while as I mentioned, should also address leakages as well. So I'll finish with that slide that I presented earlier, but I see the global trend as the result of these being shaped by the result of these two forces. On the one side, the survival of the deep pocket, as they call it, rising market power, rising on the one side, rising unemployment, inequality on the other side, and the way to bridge this gap is going to be the challenge of policy making. And I think that there's going to be a need to rethink competition policy and threats of or at least the perceived threats of international merger, the return of industrial policy are going to be also complicating the conduct of competition policy, which is, I think, the only way to sustainably find that narrow path to a more hopeful and a new world, new economy where we are hoping to get. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabah. Thank you for this presentation. A lot of interesting points that you've covered, and a lot of questions that you might have raised for us and for the audience as well. Let me, before we move to our third presentation, let me take this opportunity, Rabah, and ask you a little bit about your views for the MENA region. Just want to leverage a little bit this, your role as a chief economist for the MENA region, and maybe also the GCC in particular. Just tell us a little bit, how do you see the next 2 to 3 years as we come out of this crisis?
Yeah, so very difficult times hit by the dual shock. What we see is that obviously the oil exporters are more affected than the oil importer. Some of the GCC countries obviously have buffers, and they should use them, and they've been using them. As I mentioned, some countries, Saudi in particular, have been touching on I think on this idea that it would be time to consolidate. I actually absolutely don't think this is the right time to do fiscal consolidation yet. There is, I think, a nuance there about what can be done to create the fiscal space, which is what I call the eradication of leakages. As you know, the region is not well known for its degree of transparency, and this has resulted in tons of rent-seeking activities, including in what I call the monopolization of import sectors. So, clearly the theme of more transparency, and I know that Gulf countries have done quite a bit on digitalization. They're digitalizing their administration, trying to get there, and that's most welcome. But the way forward, clearly, for the region is to take very seriously the competition agenda and put it front and center, because the anemic growth that they had been facing before that crisis, and the risk of further zombification is absolutely a big threat. And for the MENA region to take advantage of the reconfiguration of global supply chain, especially in the Euro-Mediterranean area, they're going to have to try and build trust and these efforts on more transparency and more fair competition. I think going to be welcome move to attract more investment. And to finish, and add that the region is also notorious for not having made headways in integration, and in a world where there's going to be the emergence of further emergence of regional blocks. The region has to come out very strongly with renewed effort to integrate, and so we can exist in that regionalizing world, if you wish. But I can elaborate in the open discussion. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rabah. And yes, I think we will talk about the rise of regional blocks and what the implication on that on trade and growth and a lot of other dimensions. Let me now move to the third presentation by Dr. Jeronim Capaldo from UNCTAD. Dr. Capaldo will talk about the return to economic activity, how it looked like at the global level. Jeronim, please go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. I will keep my video off because I'm getting bad signal. It's great to be in this discussion, especially because I've heard a lot of things that signal quite an understanding and consensus on several very important policy issues where consensus hasn't always been the norm. And particularly, I agree fully with what has been said about macro policies and the general macro performance being a fundamental driver of trade, about how especially fiscal and monetary policies have different roles to play than the ones that perhaps we've discussed in previous crises, about how measures to curb corporate rent-seeking through appropriate competition policies are urgent and important in general, and how also interventions for resolving debt stress in many countries, both private and sovereign, are also urgent. I think as a broad introduction to what I will discuss, I think the theme that can be spelled out and that emerges in most discussions of macro discussions about the crisis and possibilities for recovery is that with this crisis, somehow with, of course, pose the problem of the economic stimulus at a scale and with an urgency with which we had not seen it before, coming up in discussions and policy debates. But with the question of the economic stimulus, then of course we've also realized that there are parts of aggregate demand that it is more pressing to stimulate than others because they are more relevant and more and stronger when it comes to stimulating economic activity. And these parts are very much consumption and investment, very much real investment, so not financial investment, but investment in capacity, in new capacity, and household consumption. And then, of course, when we come to that point, then what we need to ask is, what are these parts of spending supported by? And they can be supported by debt, but that comes with a lot of problems. Or they can be supported with incomes, and incomes are the part, let's say, the front door to private spending that have been under stress now for a pretty long time, especially when it comes to work incomes. And so once we recognize that work incomes haven't grown in the way they should have been growing to support a sustainable consumption demand and investment demand, because also real corporate investment depends very much on the possibility for investment to be realized, and therefore on companies having a clientele that has purchasing power. Once we realize that, then one way to look at the possibilities for recovery is to put work incomes at the center of policymaking, which is quite a shift from a lot of crisis recovery in the way we've discussed it in the past, including actually, especially after the global financial crisis of 10 years ago, when so much of the discussion was absorbed by issues of corporate financial stability. And so if we put work incomes at the center, then we can organize the whole array of macroeconomic policies, making sure that we mind the impact of those policy areas on work incomes. And so fiscal policy becomes important, not just because of the spending it can sustain, but also because the spending it sustains is one of the major determinants of the employment level. And in fact, a lot of research that we've surveyed shows that one of the main determinants of depressed employment growth over the past 10 years and before has been a tendency towards fiscal strangulation of private demand, of aggregate demand. And in fact, if we remove the tendency towards what we call a fiscal austerity in some way, then we can see better prospects for employment creation. Employment creation means work incomes, and it means private demand. Monetary policies as well, having flooded world or the global economy with a lot of credit. They have done a service in some way because they've provided relief to a lot of balance sheets, but at the same time, they have encouraged the type of financial operations that have provided short-term illusion, perhaps, about the possibilities for a recovery that has depended mostly on financial bubbles rather than the creation and the sustaining of work incomes. And then, of course, industrial policy is also very important.
Jeronim, I'm sorry, excuse me to interrupt. Just if you don't mind, since you don't have slides, do you want to put your video on?
Oh, I'm happy to try. I hope I don't get stuck because of that connection. Is that okay?
Perfect. Thank you.
So industrial policy is also an important area, because, as it turns out, the absence or the restraint and the constraints on industrial policies in many countries, especially developing countries, but also many developed countries, following the adoption of various types of rules, mostly externally imposed from the outside. The constraints on industrial policies is one of the factors that have led to a situation where there's been an imbalanced development of economies in a way that is particularly sore. It makes them particularly unfit to deal with a crisis such as the current pandemic. And I'll get back to that. I'll return on that in a moment, what I mean by imbalanced. But with that, I also want to, again, underscore how I appreciate the points made about competition policy, and how that also very much reflects the work we do at UNCTAD, because we do see the importance of being aware of the growth of corporate rent seeking and how to contain it as one of the main issues on the table right now, and as also one of the main issues related to the rise in inequality and more generally the imbalance in income distribution. Now, part of that is also related, and this is the final policy area that I want to mention, to tax policy. This is often discussed in quite polarizing terms, but in fact, a more progressive tax structure, especially when it comes to the income taxes, but also wealth taxes, is very important. Not so much because of the difference it makes or it would make in terms of fiscal revenue per se, in gross terms, but very much because of the difference it seems to be making from every study that we see when it comes to rent seeking. In other words, the ability for some individuals, whether persons or corporations, to accumulate tremendous financial funds is also what enables large investments in rent seeking, or what we sometimes call regulatory capture, that is very deep-pocketed entities that can push, even in legal ways sometimes, for laws to be written in ways that support their business. Now, with this introduction, and now I want to move into my more detailed remarks about recovery, and I want to briefly discuss what important trends that have determined the type of that have contributed to determine the type of crisis we're in right now after the pandemic has hit the global economy, and then how they matter for the type of recovery we can have. And for this, I want to utilize the framework that I discussed a moment ago, and mainly stay close to work incomes. Now, in the world, since at least the early 1970s, we have seen a steady decline of the labor share of GDP in basically all of G20 countries, with very few exceptions in very short periods. The United States is is the perhaps clearest example, but not the only one. And after 1970, the labor share has steadily declined, of course with waves, and it's now at the level of the 1950s. And if things keep going at the rate at which they've been going for the past 5 years, in another 5 years, 5 or 10 years, the United States labor share will be at the brink of the abyss level it reached in 1929. And things aren't very different in other developed and developing G20 economies. Now, the problem here is that, of course, labor share falling depends on two main factors. One is wage growth, and another one is productivity growth. Now, or better, the part of productivity growth that is passed on to wages. Now, wages haven't grown very much. In fact, wage growth has slowed in pretty much all of G20 countries. That's the world's largest economies since the 80s, and even more since the 90s. And this is surely because there has been a decline in productivity growth, but not just. It's also because there has been what we can call wage repression. In other words, even where and to the extent to which productivity has grown, wages haven't grown that much because the gains from productivity growth have accrued mostly to profits. And as a result, the growth of work incomes has been constrained and sometimes has become negative. Now, we see this pretty much everywhere. The next edition of the Trade and Development Report that will come out in mid-September has a detailed analysis of that. But the gist of it is that there's been quite a lot of wage repression, and there's been, certainly there has been slower productivity growth. Now, there are many explanations for slower productivity growth, but one important explanation that is rising in importance recently is one that sheds light on one of the reasons why we've been observing growing inequality everywhere in the world. And this is the fact that average productivity has surely slowed down, but when we look within the when we take a sector level look at the economy, we realize that in many economies, this is both advanced and developing, that in many economies we have a shrinking number of sectors that have growing productivity or faster productivity growth over the decades, and an expanding number of sectors where productivity growth declines. And this is because the sectors, the advanced sectors, let's say the high-tech sectors, for example, are in fact shrinking in terms of their employment share, and jobs are being transferred, they're being created more in the low productivity sectors, where we see an exodus of workers, and at the same time, a downward pressure on wages. So we can have a lot of it. We have, for example, the United States, where we see jobs being transferred towards low productivity, low wage jobs, such as accommodation, food, transport, and in many cases even education and health. And we see a growing share of employees or jobs paying lower wages and contributing lower productivity. Now, with this structure, it is no wonder that private demand for goods and services and for residential investment is running out of steam. And the question is then, what can we do about it? What can policymakers do about it? And the general answer is, well, there should be there should be better wage growth in the coming decade, at least, to partially recoup the decrease in the labor share that we've observed now for 40 years. But this is not going to happen. It's even supposing that policymakers were willing and able to do that. This is not going to happen just by jacking up minimum wages or introducing rules on wage growth. It can only happen if every other parts of the macro policy apparatus is consistent with that. And that means, of course, as a first order of business, suspending or stopping this approach to fiscal management that is basically a form of fiscal austerity, and focusing on the fact that, as it's been said earlier, the fiscal space that is necessary. It is true, obviously, that sometimes it is limited, and it certainly is more limited for some countries than for others. But this is often overlooking the fact that fiscal space can be created through growth. But for that to happen, countries need to have the policy independence that is required for this type of operation, rather than being subject to the tight control of bond markets that, in fact, for most countries, do not offer the freedom that sometimes they're made out to offer. The same goes for monetary policies that should worry less about generating the next bubble, or perhaps should worry less about creating credit per se, and a little more about where credit is going, because as we have noticed in the past 9 years at least, the massive amount of credit creation has not generated any increase, or barely any increase, in real investment. But it has generated, so where has this credit gone? It has gone into what we call financial investment, broadly speaking. And so this is something that needs to change, of course. Meanwhile, for developing countries to enter or accelerate in their industrialization transition, then the policies that have been preventing them from doing that on the financial side, but also on the regulatory side, and how sometimes trade agreements have impeded technology transfers, or the discussion on technology transfer, even better, that should also change. I think I can stop here in the interest of the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeronim. Thank you for the presentation. I also have quick follow-up questions for you on what you just talked about. Actually, I have two follow-up questions, but I ask you one now, and I'll keep one for the second part of this conversation. I wanted to ask, when you talked about the downward trend when you described labor productivity, and you talked about the labor share and the downward trend that we've seen over the last maybe couple of decades, I wonder to what extent the current crisis and the way we're envisaging the post-COVID world to look like, whether this will be a further acceleration of this trend, or you see some sort of a reversal of that?
Okay. Yeah, I think we can see. Well, we've already now we have to make a quick distinction here. As in almost every crisis, the first thing to fall is profits. Profits fall much faster than wages. So the first thing that statistics pick up is a fall in profit. Wages don't fall as quickly because people are not fired as quickly. And therefore, the first thing that national accounts pick up is an increase in the labor share. This has happened almost in every crisis. But 6 months or a year later, then we see labor incomes dropping faster and not recovering for a long time. And this is what we've seen in almost every crisis. So are we going to see this even this time, and are we going to see this trend in accelerated form? Obviously, it's too early to say, but one indication in this direction is that if we look just at the most vulnerable jobs that exist in the global economy right now, we can count them just very roughly by taking some of the vulnerable service sectors, such as accommodation and food, transport, retail, and some other sectors like the air transport. When we count these vulnerable jobs, this is pretty much 15%. Globally, this is 15% of jobs, of employees. So that's something like 500, depending on you count, so 130 million jobs in the world that we can roughly assume have already been cut. And these tend to be all low productivity, low wage jobs, even within their own countries. Now, these numbers are bigger in developing countries where there's a lot of informality, obviously, and where some of these low productivity, low wage jobs are even bigger in number. So when we look at these figures, it seems reasonable to conclude that this particular crisis will accelerate and will aggravate the trend towards the secular decrease of the labor share, and with it productivity, because the problem with it is that as wage growth slows or perhaps turns negative, then the incentive for companies to adopt labor-saving innovation, which is one of the strongest engines of economic growth, then all that disappears.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, thank you all for this great presentations. Let me go on now for our second part, where we have more of a general discussion. We have received some questions from the audience as you were speaking. I would also ask you, if you don't mind, to put your cameras on so we can see all of you. Maybe I can start up front with a question that, I wasn't very explicit in your presentations about maybe the duration or the shape of the recovery going forward. And I was wondering, maybe in few words, if you can, each one of you could describe basically how do they see the return to normal over the couple of years or next couple of years, or more or less. How do they see kind of the recovery, whether it's trade flows or investment flows or economic activity in general? So maybe we can start from here to get a sense from you. What do you see over the next few years? Maybe we'll start with Bob.
Thanks, Sean. I think this is a very difficult question to answer, given the really unique circumstances that the global economy is in. I think there's a lot of things that need to go right for us to get back on a fast growth track. I think so many of those things are complex. Rabah was talking about competition policy. I think that's something I failed to put in as one of the factors in my discussion. Jeroen has talked about wage inequality, growing inequalities, how you deal with these things. The fundamental forces, I think, that are driving much of the challenges relate to technological change that have created the ability to substitute either technology or cheaper labor from other parts of the world into a production process. And I think it's going to be very important for, as well as I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Pettis, but he's written some very good books on sort of financialization, global capital flows. It's less about countries, and it's more about people who own capital having a great deal of flexibility and being able to move it around because of the development of various rules. So I'm cautiously optimistic that the pandemic crisis is big enough to get the attention of policymakers. But those policymakers really need to be looking forward, not necessarily looking backward. And I fear that when you look at some of the rise of populism in the global economy, it's been about, let's go back to the 1960s or 1970s. I don't think you can go back there. You know, I think you need to shape the future economy the way that you want and the way that's going to be inclusive, and that will allow productivity, efficiency, high quality investment. But I think there are a lot of forces that need to be overcome for that to happen. And the policy environment needs to be coordinated. And that's what worries me the most. I worry that we think we can manage the economy by looking at these policy areas separately. And you're likely to make some mistakes. You then need to revise your policies if you make mistakes, learn as you do, update and revise. And many policy environments get pretty fixed pretty quickly. So I'll stop there. That was kind of not a very straightforward answer, but I think it reflects the complicated world we're living in right now.
Thank you, Bob. You're right. I was looking for more an explicit prediction, but that's fine. We take that. Rabah?
I agree with the sense of pessimism that Bob had, but I'll to summarize and be succinct, I'll say that it's going to be a messy recovery, messy from the health standpoint, and we again the rosy forecast that we have had, the successful rosy forecast did not this sense that we've been over optimistic on both the health and the economic front. And I think the best predictor of where we're going to land is today, is what's happening today, and it's messy on the health front, messy on the economic front for the reason we all, I think, mentioned, both on the international front but also on the domestic front. The risk of zombification is there. It's been there in the region for a long time, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. But and zombification is not just a Japan story. It's coming to Europe, to the US. So the difficulty to go from relief to stimulus is going to hinge upon a clean recovery on the health front, so we get trust back in the system at the domestic level. At the global level, the strategic rivalry between the US and China is adding to that very complex domestic picture. And what we see from data on investment, on greenfield investment, is that most of the FDI has dried out, talking for the region. And interestingly, some sectors like the energy ones and energy, electricity, all that stuff has been less affected. Obviously, the tourism sector is drying out, the most. Again, a trust story, an issue of that is going to be with us. So at the sectoral level, for the region, I can see energy and all the stuff around that surviving. The tourism activity, again, we will need to up our standards in ways that are, very different from what we've done in the past. And on the I was going to say on the more digital front. There, I worry about about that concentration issue that's going to come into play, and that's where competition policy comes into the picture. But there are so many other objectives like industrial policy, things that are coming to the debate, the merger, the international merger, all that are gonna render complex the post-COVID recovery. So messy, and the best predictor is today. Is not the hopeful solution through a vaccine that will solve everything. So just look at where we are today.
Although today we heard some news from Russia about the vaccine, so this might be hopeful.
But, yeah, hopeful, but also very important to know that whatever Putin is telling us about the vaccine, would the world trust him? That's an issue.
Good point. Jeronim, do you want to say something about a prediction for the next few years?
Yeah, just like everybody, I wish I knew. There's, having to make a projection and having to choose a shape, we're choosing some kind of incomplete V shape, because very likely we'll see a recovery next year. It doesn't mean it's a recovery of incomes or spending in the sense that it'll go back where they were. It certainly doesn't mean the peak that it will go back to the same people, and that's the other major problem. But in some way, that's inevitable given the extent of the contraction we had this year. So it's unprecedented. It would be unprecedented to have another recession. I mean, another year of negative growth next year, because compared to this year, which is record bad, probably not going to happen. But we also believe we'll not go back there next year or even in 2022 by looking at the developments in every component of income. But it's really too early to say because the policy factor is tremendously uncertain and tremendously relevant. I think maybe I just want to just quickly follow up about my 1970 comment, and to clarify, I don't mean that as a destination for us to go, but I mean it as an important example for us to be aware of, because this was the pinnacle of 2 or 3 decades, depending on how you count, of balanced income distribution and fast growth altogether, and sustainable global finances. And it's important for us to be aware of that example because these are very important things that we're trying to achieve. And we want to learn from the experience that we had when we actually did achieve them. Of course, we have to be able to achieve them in today's global economy, not in the global economy of 40 years ago. But we don't want to forget that one important marker of that experience was a more balanced distribution of income between labor and profits.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you. I have, as I said, a few questions coming in. I was looking at my phone on that. One question that maybe, I'll pose it to the three of you, and please feel free maybe to answer or choose to delegate the answer to others. But, we have seen, and I think you've talked about that, significant policy response for the crisis from a lot of governments. There's monetary policy and fiscal policy and health policy and others. And obviously governments have played a significant more important role over the last few months than would have never ever imagined before, whether in the social sector, health sector, and economic sectors. To what extent do you think that we've drawn, there are some early lessons from this type of government intervention in terms of managing the crisis? And to what extent you see the world, I know we're still in the middle of this pandemic, but are we more ready for future pandemics going forward? Who wants to start on that?
Happy to jump in.
Please go ahead, Rabah.
So, yeah, definitively a crisis of lack of preparedness, and you know, we see it in the U.S. We haven't made that much progress from the time when we imposed lockdowns, which were really predicated as way to buy time and fix our response and get it right. So even in advanced economy, the lockdown measures, which again were designed to buy time, have not yielded a more strategic, more focused, more targeted and strategic response. So I worry that this lack of preparedness is with us, and confirm that this crisis is going to be the recovery is going to be messy. So I do think that we have overlooked the importance of investing in this capability, this specific capability, and for the region in particular, the lack of data disclosure, lack of transparency for many countries puts us in a very difficult spot, because the ability of the successful country to be able to have just-in-time response and targeted response using the both statistical and technological tool is really the investment that would get us out of these hyper infectious diseases. And so far, I don't see the building up of capability happening, and there seem to be a loose, indication that we should do something about it, but not precise, and that worries me a lot. And the U.S. is in that similar vein.
Thank you, Rabah. Bob?
Thanks. I express some cautious optimism, and I think part of that cautious optimism is the result of watching the fiscal and monetary policy response in this crisis compared to the great financial crisis. So I think governments learned that they needed to take aggressive action. I think what Rabah talked about is also what we're doing now, hopefully, is learning that in other policy areas, health policy areas, and things like that, that we have to learn from the mistakes we've made this time, so that the next time it hits, we're better prepared to address it. Unfortunately, I think both from a scientific and a humanistic perspective, humans make mistakes. And we have to learn from those mistakes, but the next time is likely to be different, and we'll have to adapt to different circumstances, and we won't always get it right. They're just, even you get the best epidemiologists together today, they'll tell you there's a problem, most of them. There's one or two who might say, oh, it's not a problem. But they don't necessarily agree on the extent of the problem. All the models are different. That's not an excuse to not take action. It just tells us that no matter what policy decisions we make, there'll be some uncertainty. And earlier I talked about flexibility and adapting if your policy's not working. I think that's a key thing. Learn from the past. Try to design your policy response based on those learnings, adapted to the new circumstances. If it doesn't work, think about what is and is not working. For that, you need to have expertise. You need to have open debate, but you need effective decision making. I'd also like to just take a moment. Jarona, my comments about 1970 weren't related to your comment about 1970. It's more this view that they want to take the world back to a simpler place in time, where a certain element of the population had, unique position in the economy. If it's not in a group of people, it might have been an institution. That's the thing that I think is the mistake with many populists is it would be nice to get back to that level of wage distribution and things like that. That's a reasonable goal. I don't think you achieve it by trying to turn society backwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. I also want to talk a little bit about the legacies coming out of COVID-19. And you've mentioned a few of them, and I want to raise 2 or 3 points, and maybe you will choose and select which point you want to respond to. I want to basically, as we come out of this, obviously there's the inequality challenge that I think the 3 of you talked about. There's also a debt crisis in the making that Rabah referred to. We have an investment issue with the large outflow investments out of emerging markets, and the points that both Bob and Jeronim made about the implication of that in terms of trade and growth going forward. So this is what I have in mind, like inequality, debt, investment. These are kind of the legacies of this crisis. And maybe each one of you could pick on one of these themes to elaborate a little bit more on those. Maybe we can start with Rabah on inequality.
I was going to actually pick debt, but I
okay, no, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. No, I just want to, I just don't want to just talk about legacy, but I also want to talk about solutions, maybe. So on the debt front, clearly, if you take the sovereign, the highest rated sovereign, they're all going to land with, say, 20 percentage point higher debt. So we're going to live in a new world there. And what I think is not happening is the reckoning of that by rating agencies, but also, to be frank, also, international financial institutions are heavily dependent on rating agencies for their balance sheet. So, in many respects, if we live in a world where there's this incredible shift in the level of debt by the frontier, I mean, the frontier being the risk or perceived risk-free debt countries, I would say, sovereign. Then there's a need to realize that rating agencies need to adapt to that brave new world, and I think engaging that would solve quite a bit of the problems, including the ability of international financial institutions to lend more and to try and put a handle on that giant hole that's before us, that abyss that's before us. So especially to finance the health response and put us on a firm path to recovery. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jeronim.
Yeah, legacies. Going back, I want to hark back to something Bob said, and first of all, I want to say I completely share his view about the past. I'm very happy this came out clearly. In some way, it's true. Yeah, we have to learn. I mean, it's certainly true that we have to learn from the mistakes we're making this time, but there are also mistakes we've made the last time. Then there was a global recession that it'd be important not to go to waste. And one of these is related to the inequality challenge, because the story last time, 10 years ago, was that basically after the pronouncements, that there is, we have to leave serious reforms in terms of income distribution for better times. But the problem is that as we keep doing that, this keeps undermining one of the important foundations of aggregate demand. And that, I mean, beyond the ethical problem, which is, of course, a real problem, there's this issue of trying to generate private incomes that is just not happening, and the crisis isn't doing anything better. And I wish I shared
the optimism about policy responses, because when I think about that, there's a few realities we have to take into account. Let's take the United States, for example. The largest relief package or stimulus program, depending how you want to call it, it was adopted a few months ago, was this 2.2 trillion package. So this went into the headlines as a 2.2 trillion stimulus or relief or whatever, a package of 2.2 trillion. But then you look into it, which is what we did. And then it turns out that for 2020, once you take out all the credit measures that, of course, is going to be repaid or supposedly so, once you take that out, what really is real spending is something like $400 million. You add a multiplier effect, you get to something like $600 million in 2020. So in the face of loss of work incomes in the order of 1 trillion for the vulnerable categories that I discussed earlier, we have extra spending of short of $600 billion. So you see, in fact, the urgency of the moment doesn't seem to be really reflected in the type of fiscal measures that are actually being applied once we depart from the headline numbers. And that is the major cause of concern I think when we look at the possibilities for a recovery and whether we're going to solve these issues, because they're all very much related to this type of intervention. The debt problem is a big one. We've estimated in our April policy brief on the Great Meltdown. We talk about a 2 trillion shortage for developing countries who are going to have to make debt service in the next year or two. And that is a major fiscal crisis waiting to happen. We see it in the US too, where state governments are going to have to fire people if they don't get the relief they need. So there's optimism in the sense that we know a lot of the playbook is big and we could use it, but it doesn't seem like it's really being used so far when it comes to the macro picture.
Thank you. Bob, do you have anything on this?
Well, I'll just say this. I think we are seeing some countries doing things that are working better than other countries. And General Nim was mentioning the US. I happen to be from the US. I follow that debate pretty closely. And I think it's interesting because much of the policy debate does not really seem to be informed by modern empirical economic research. And I think what we hopefully can do is refine the playbook that Jeronim was talking about and identify what seems to work better in which circumstances, and hopefully be able to educate policymakers. They have improved from the great financial crisis in some respects. We could have been having a debate, we don't need to do this at all. It really wasn't that debate. I see that as a step forward. Then the question is well, how do we structure the package? That I think, and I said in my presentation, it depends on how effective these big policies are. Jeronim has probably looked at this much more closely than I have. But I do worry that the structure of some of the programs in some countries may not be as effective as they need to be. But we are likely to see policies in other countries that have been very effective. So what can we learn from that? Make sure we update, refine the playbook, and make sure policymakers get that put in front of them.
Thank you.
I can talk about trade in that respect, by the way, but that would be another long conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. Actually, I want to talk about trade. We still have a few more minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about what you, Bob, called re-globalization, the slowdown of global trade flows, the rise of regional blocs. And I just want to pose it to you. What do you see going forward in terms of these trends, the regional blocs, the trade flows, the reshoring. Can you maybe we start with Bob and go to the others?
Thanks, Sean. I think regional blocks are going to continue. I think there'll be continued regional integration. I do think folks will come back to the WTO and look for ways to modernize it, update it. We see some of those discussions right now around joint statement initiatives where like-minded countries want to take things forward. You look back at the GATT, that was pretty much the pattern of the GATT and led to much of its progress. But it also has to deal with some of these more modern issues and deal with finding ways to ensure. So I think one of the things in the trade area that has surprised many policymakers, and I say this regularly to ambassadors who come to see me, is trade negotiators are too busy looking backwards. When they negotiate, they're thinking about the world that was. They're not necessarily thinking about the world that is and where it's going. And part of my unit's been trying to generate scenarios about the potential for the future. And I think negotiators need to think about a more flexible system, a more adaptable system, and one that can address a rapidly changing economic environment. And I think that the updating of how we go about multilateral cooperation in trade can have many lessons for multilateral cooperation in other areas. I actually think the Paris Agreement on climate was a very interesting approach to trying to reach an agreement. Now, perhaps it's not working as well as folks wanted, but the approach that they used was, if you want to complain about somebody else's proposal, you need to provide an alternative suggestion. That really doesn't happen at the WTO. It's sort of like, nah, we don't like that, we're not going to talk about it. And I think that you need to get this idea that we're in this together and we want to come up with solutions. Let's have concrete exchange of relevant ideas, even if we don't necessarily agree. Let's exchange on what those details, those mechanisms might be. So, if people are looking for trade to go back to what we saw in what some people call the long 1990s, I think that's an unreasonable expectation. The frontier is probably Africa, and we see a big, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that has great potential. Very optimistic about it. I think we at the WTO would like to see that happen. We think that kind of regional integration helps build support. It becomes a laboratory of experimentation that can help bring the multilateral trading system forward. So I'm reasonably optimistic. I don't see the long 1990s. I don't see that as being something to aim for. I guess I'm thinking aim for slow and steady, and be flexible, adopt things that work, revisit things if they're not working anymore, and find a way forward. Because trade, the exchange of ideas, the cross-border spillovers that occur are huge. I definitely think that those impacts are much bigger than those net debt weight loss triangles that I spent much of my early career calculating for the US government. Yeah, those are useful to know, and I'm very interested in that political economy debate. But shifting out that production possibility frontier is what matters. It's what, making people more productive, ensuring that they gain from those productivity gains. I think that's a key element, and trade is very important here.
Thank you, Bob. Geronim?
Yeah, I agree. No question that trade is very important, and I think we all share the view of the advantages that can come from trade. That Bob described earlier. There's an important discussion to be had about, the fact that not all trade is created equal in some way, and that, of course, there are a lot of exchanges that happen within a regulatory framework that doesn't let all participants to that exchange enjoy the gains in the same way, and that's obviously one of the problems, and that's probably one of the problems at the root of the reform processes of the WTO. And I guess it's in everybody's interest if that reform process goes along the lines that Bob mentioned a moment ago. That for sure. In terms of whether we see dramatic change in the blocks or in the pattern of trade, my answer is no. We don't see dramatic change happening anytime soon. The blocks, we definitely see the blocks staying for the foreseeable future, and we also don't see the disruption of trade that we're seeing this year lasting very long. The question in the background, though, is that reglobalization per se, as much as we do see it happen, probably, isn't necessarily going to address the problem. In itself, it isn't going to cure the growth anemia of the global economy, because much like we discussed earlier, the benefits of trade are enormous, but they're not the strategy to reflate the global economy. You can't expect that from trade. That strategy has to come from other policies, and trade is very much dependent on those policies. So again, the answer here is we don't see massive change happen in the next, well, obviously it already happened in 2020. Well, some substantial drop happened in 2020. We don't see that lasting another year or two, but at the same time, we're also conscious about the evolution of the policies that matter for that, which are the macro policies.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jeroen. We're just closing on time, so I want to finish up with you, Rabah. On the same theme, I want you to talk a little bit about regional blocks, particularly MENA and also Africa, and also the role of IFIs and regional development banks. I know you're in that transition as well, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you very much. I'm also very optimistic and hopeful about the Africa Continental Free Trade Initiative, but I'm also worried, and I'm hoping the Middle East will join in. I'm always worried about the tension in the region, and I thought for the Middle East to join in a bigger union might dissipate or dilute some of the tension amongst neighbors in the region. So also for strategic region, there's plenty to gain by bringing that part of the Middle East together with the Africa. Also because it's been sitting between two different continents, so maybe a good time to do that whilst taking advantage of its trade with Asia, of course. And so I'd like to make one point about the urgency for the region to get into that bandwagon of integration. We've been much talk about it, but little action. And I think to get it right, maybe we should start narrow and deep as opposed to broad and shallow. And that also is true for the Africa Continental Trade Initiative. And there's plenty of area where this could happen. But I agree with Jerome that it is important when you go narrow and deep that it's multifaceted, and you need to worry about tax policy, competition policy, as well as trade policy. And we have seen too often through tax evasion or profit shifting, but also through issues of competition, the potential gains from trade being dissipated. So important to go narrow and deep. And for Africa, it seems obvious to me that agriculture, food is going to be a top priority, and getting narrow there, but while having that integrated framework of policy to avoid leakages, because those are these are giant hole in the global system, which is that if, say, a small country were to decide to specialize in being a tax haven, this would dissipate most of the gains. So we've got to watch for all these leakages by having an integrated policy framework, but be narrow and deep, and go for early success, so that then we build credible integration agreement. So the urgency of it, but also the need to be narrow and deep. I'll stop here.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Rabah, Jeroen, and Bob. I think this has been a great conversation. We ran out of time, but I think we've covered a lot of extremely interesting areas. A lot of challenges ahead, obviously. I tried to, push you towards a little bit more optimism, but I think the challenges are unprecedented, and we hope that the world and our region will manage through these difficult times going forward. Let me now, let me thank you, all of you. And I want to pass on the microphone to my colleagues in Trends, Research and Advisory for their closing remarks from the Director General. Dr. Ahmed, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Fars. Dear respected panelists, valued audience and floors, a very good evening. Tonight's evening brings to an end our very first Trends Global Economic Forum, which included 4 symposiums spread across 6 weeks. This year, we assembled 20 well-known experts from 12 major economics and international organizations who highlighted the different COVID-19 implications on the global economy and evaluated the varying response to it. They made projections about the future of economy and provided adequate recommendation as well. Trends Global Economy Forum will be an annual event and will continue to discuss the main economic issues and trends facing the global economy. COVID-19, which has infected 20 million people and caused more than 700,000 deaths so far, is a medical, humanitarian, and economic crisis that has hit countries worldwide. Lockdown measures taken to contain the spread of COVID-19 have restricted movements and brought economic activities to a standstill, resulting in thousands of companies going bankrupt and millions losing their jobs. Governments have responded with massive stimulus programs to support companies and citizens on a scale never witnessed before. The global will contract by 4.9% in 2020, according to IMF, and will recover somewhat next year. However, uncertainty remains high as the global economy faces strong headwinds and the rising number of new cases and uncertainty surrounding an effective vaccine. During the first Global Economic Forum Symposium held on June 30, 5 speakers dealt with the effects of COVID-19. The speakers emphasized the fact that that threat could only be stopped through global cooperation. The second event, Economic Stimulus Programs, Requirements and Challenges, had 5 speakers discussing financial tools such as frequent liquidity injections, and the risk of asset price overvaluations. The third symposium explored the reopening of the national and global economies and the lesson learned in the process. 6 speakers participated in the event discussing sources of financial instability and long-term economic prospects. The future of global economy, growth challenges and risks of depression was the title of our 4th symposium, in which 3 speakers discussed important issues such as the reopening of the economic activity and the uncertainty surrounded the global economic recovery. Having come this far in such a short time, I must first thank all moderates and speakers for their immense contribution to this forum. I must also thank all the audience and viewers who logged in at various times zones from different parts of the world to participate and ask questions. The great team we have at Trends, as usual, did an excellent job in making this forum successful in otherwise challenging time. I would like to take this opportunity to invite you to follow the coming Trends Symposium entitled Global Anti-COVID-19 Treatment Between Development Efforts and Regulatory Protocols, which will be organized by the Center on Wednesday, 26 August 2020 at 7 p.m. UAE mean time, and a number of experts, research, and professionals from institutions, centers, and companies that are developing the vaccines of COVID-19 will be presenting at this symposium. Finally, accept my honest appreciation and wishes you all the best. Thank you a lot and have a very good evening. Thank you all, Dr. John Faris, Dr. Bob, Dr. Rabah, and Dr. Kabadlo. Thank you a lot for your really interesting presentation, and see you, inshallah, in our next coming events. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.